What are you supposed to do if you find yourself in a really bad podcast interview? Like things have just taken the turn for the worse. You just found yourself sweating in a really uncomfortable situation. What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to recover from being in a position of a really bad podcast interview? That's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get right to it. Hey y'all, Krystal here today, and I'm actually excited to talk to you about bad podcast interviews, right? That doesn't sound like a topic that I should be really excited to talk about, but it makes me excited only because I have this wisdom to share with you in hopes that you never have to live through a bad podcast interview. I've been doing this for some time now. I have more than 200 podcast episodes under my belt, and I have lots of wisdom to share with you when it comes to bad podcast interviews that have happened from time to time. It's not something that, it's not a reoccurring thing that happens every single week or all the time. So don't scare away. It's okay. This happens every once in a while, but I want you to be prepared in case it happens to you. So I'm going to give you 4 ways to recover from a bad podcast interview. So if you find yourself in a situation where things have just taken a turn for the worse and you don't really know what to do, the first thing I want you to do is ask yourself, what is my goal? If you are in the middle, like someone's talking and you're just like, oh my gosh, this is totally not what I expected. This person's a terrible fit for my show. Ask yourself, what was my goal? What were we trying to accomplish here? Because maybe it's actually not a bad podcast interview. Maybe you just kind of went down the wrong path. Maybe you started talking about something that wasn't related to what your actual goal was with that episode. And I say this all the time, but if all else fails, go back to value. How can you and your guest add value to your show? So maybe you had an original idea that's just totally gone out the window. It's not even relevant anymore. Go back to your goal, because hopefully your ultimate goal is to add value to your audience. How can you make that happen? How can you still reach your goal while trying to recover from this bad podcast interview experience? So that's the first thing that I want you to ask yourself is, what was my goal and how can I get back to that original point that we were trying to come across with this podcast interview? The second way for you to recover from a bad podcast interview is to get back on topic. Stay on topic is like the thing that should be like burned into your brain while you're talking, is like, we got to stay focused. We got to stay on topic. It's okay to go off on a few personal tangents here and there, tell some stories, make it personal, make it relatable. But at the end of the day, you have to know your goal, right? We already talked about goals, but you have to be on topic. If your guest starts telling their life story that has nothing to do with what you're talking about, your job as the host is to reel them back in and say, yeah, that's fantastic. I love that story. I want to go back to, and start talking about your original topic. That's the easiest way to reel someone back in or to take them from one place to the next. Your job is to steer them and where you want to go, going back to your goal. What is your topic? You need to stay focused, because at the end of the day, most listeners don't want to listen to a podcast that's scattered and all over the place. You're going to end up going way over your time limit, which is actually number 3. The third way to get back on track from a bad podcast interview is to honor the time frame. Honor it. This is something that you should have set as an expectation before you ever even start recording. Let your guests know, hey, today's interview is going to be roughly 30 minutes or 45 minutes or 60 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever it is for your podcast. But make sure that people know that and have that in your mind as soon as you start recording. That way you know that if you're 5 minutes into this thing and you're like, okay, we just got to make it through 15 more minutes of this interview and then we will be done. And then at that point, it's up to you whether you even want to air the interview or there's other things that you can consider once it's done if you can never fully recover from the bad interview. But I definitely want you to mind the time frame. Think about it the entire time you're recording, because if all of it is fantastic, like you're on a great interview up until a point, and then all of a sudden things switch, things turn, maybe you go down a political place that you didn't want to go, or someone just all of a sudden starts cursing like crazy and you never expected that to happen, like you go off on a tangent or you get into a disagreement, whatever it is, there's a million ways a podcast interview can go really, really bad, really, really quick. But I want you to mind the time frame. If you've gotten to the end of the podcast, you've gotten some value already, wrap it up and be done with it. Like, just wrap it up. Wrap it up. It was the time frame. They said their piece. You said what you wanted to say. You're adding value to your audience. Wrap it up. Mind that time frame that you set for your guest and the podcast before you ever even got started. So I want you to comment below and tell me if you've ever had a bad podcast interview experience. There's no name calling. I don't want you to call anybody out and say, oh yeah, so-and-so from this podcast, it was so terrible. No. We're not doing any of that around here. But I want you to tell me, have you had an experience where maybe someone spoke too long, or maybe they never talked at all? I had an interview one time where it felt like it was pulling teeth, just trying to get someone to speak just a little bit. They were giving me like, yes, no, maybe kind of answers. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get to the end of this interview. And is this interview, is it even going to be good? A good podcast for my audience to listen to? But we recovered and the interview actually turned out fantastic once we got going. They just needed to get out of their shell a little bit. So tell me what kind of experience you've had with bad podcast interviews. And if you haven't had any, tell me that too. Say, no, Krystal, we're all good here, because I want to congratulate you and let you know that's fantastic. And that's all I have. So let me know in the comments and we're going to get back to the video. And the fourth way that I want you to think about whenever it comes to recovering from a bad podcast interview is to remember, be nice, be genuine. Don't ever be ugly to a guest, because let me tell you, when it comes to podcast circles and communities, word gets around pretty quickly. If you are interviewing someone within your industry, or it just goes back to the golden rule, right? I don't know if you have kids. I don't know if you grew up this way, but I have children, and I think about what we were taught as kids, and it's the golden rule, right? Be nice to others. Treat others the way that you want to be treated. So be nice to someone, even if you're having a terrible experience and you know this person is never going to be your BFF and you may never talk to them again because you have nothing in common, and you realize that on this podcast interview because it went so badly. Be nice at the end of the day. Be nice, be genuine, and just have some common decency to respect the other person, because that goes such a long way. But that's all I have for you today. So I hope you learned something about bad podcast interviews and how to avoid them and how to recover from them if you end up in an experience that is less than a great podcast interview. But make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe below if you haven't already. And be sure to check out these other podcasting videos that we put out every single week without fail. It's what we love to talk about around here. Podcasting. And remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.